IVT Network is proud to present the Compounding Pharmacy Compliance Conference, a virtual event with something for all. Compounders continue to face extreme scrutiny while navigating an evolving regulatory landscape, changing roles and responsibilities of drug compounders, as well as the continued impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, this Compounding Pharmacy Compliance Conference comes at an extremely relevant time. Registration is now open for the industry's leading conference for compounding professionals, providing the necessary tools and tactics to strengthen compounding systems and processes. Attendees of this acclaimed virtual event will take part in 2 days of live sessions featuring interactive content, packed with key insights on the evolving regulatory landscape, gaps in FDA guidance, and opportunities for clarity, techniques, and best practices to ensure accuracy and sterility in drug compounding. There will be actionable procedures and tools to embrace organizational change and efficiency resources and the role of automation in the future of drug compounding. Plus, pharmacists can earn up to 11 ACPE credits. Visit informaconnect.com/compounding-pharmacy-compliance for all the details on agenda, registration, and special group rates for teams.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. A drug may be known by different names during its development and commercial life cycle. Medication safety problems associated with drug names have long been recognized as a significant problem by healthcare professionals. Whether it's look-alike or sound-alike errors, drug modifier misidentification, or proprietary versus non-proprietary names, confusion may lead to medication errors, which of course can have fatal effects on patients and consumers. Today, we're going to discuss the particulars of the drug naming process, definitions and categories for drug names, and hear case study scenarios where drug name communications have led to adverse events. Our guests for this discussion are Karen Zimm and Paul Pluta. It's great to have you. Welcome to both.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So this topic is extremely important in pharmaceutical development and manufacture, and a series of articles outlining specifics in medication naming and errors have appeared in the Journal of GXP Compliance. Paul, can you tell us what the catalyst for this series of papers was and why this topic is so important from a regulatory and compliance perspective?
Okay, Stacey, thank you. It really is an important topic. You know, if you want to scare yourself, Google drug medication errors or something like that, and you'll see how many errors there are in the world. It's really a terrible number. And you know, the errors are made by healthcare practitioners, by the users. But the problem is that industry makes up the names, makes up the products, makes up the labels and so forth, which are the direct, let's say, the cause or the background for the errors. So what our objective was to make industry people, and our readers are mostly industry people, make them aware of errors, with the thought being that if they had a better awareness of errors, they might do a better job in designing the drug names, designing the packaging, deciding the appearance and so forth, and perhaps reduce the incidence of errors. So that was our hope for starting the program.
Excellent. And that makes total sense because you have to understand what the problem is before you can help remediate it. But before we dive in on the issues surrounding drug naming, let's better understand some of the drug name basics. Karen, can you provide an overview of small molecule drug names?
Sure. So a drug can have several different names. It can be known by several different naming conventions. The first one that we typically see is the chemical name. And that is a name that reflects the molecular structure of the compound. And typically chemical names can become very complex and cumbersome when it comes to using them for general use during prescribing and just discussing with your healthcare practitioners. The next name that we often see is what we refer to as a shorthand version of a chemical name or a code. And that's typically used in-house at a company during the research and development process of that compound.
Okay.
And then we also have the generic name and the brand name. So the generic name is what we also call the official name, and that is in the US assigned by the United States Adopted Name Council, which then provides that information to the World Health Organization, and consensus is made on the name. But that generic name is what is typically used when the drug goes off patent, and then we have multiple manufacturers of the same product on the market. So many companies will be able to refer to that same compound by the same generic name, and it just simplifies things. You also can have combination names if there are 2 or more compounds that are formulated into a same dosage form, also known as an FDC or a fixed dose combination. And then lastly, we have the brand name or the proprietary name, which is a process and is developed specifically by the company that is developing the compound. And that brand name would identify that compound as exclusive property of a company, and a company uses that for brand recognition.
So it sounds like one drug could potentially have a lot of different names throughout the life cycle.
Yes, and that's what causes some confusion.
Exactly.
The pharmaceutical companies love to have that brand name recognition for obvious reasons. They want you to purchase and purchase their product. But when it goes off patent and the generic name comes into play, then there's multiple players in the game at that point.
Thank you. Yes, for sure. Similarly, there is a whole category of biologics which have unique regulatory requirements. Paul, can you provide a similar overview from the biologics perspective?
The names for the biologics are similar to the names for the small molecules. So we're talking about 2 categories here in general: small molecules and biologics. Now, Karen explained 3 basic names. We have number 1, the chemical name; number 2, the non-proprietary name or the generic name; and 3, the proprietary, the brand name. Mm-hmm. Now, when you have the, go back to slide 2, please. Okay, so slide 2, there you go. So chemical, non-proprietary, in the case of small molecules, generic. In the case of biologics, it's called the biosimilar name, okay? And then finally proprietary, which is the brand name. Okay, so now let's look at the next slide, please, number 3, slide 3. So biologics and small molecules, same general name categories. Now, when we look in a little bit more detail, we have 3, let's say, subcategories of names: the prefix, the infix, and the suffix. Now, the suffix tells you the therapeutic or the pharmacologic category of the drug name. So we have ACE inhibitors, we have antibiotics, we have cephalosporins, we have penicillin. So that's usually a suffix or an infix or a prefix. So that's very straightforward on the small molecules. When it gets into the biologics, it gets a little bit more complicated, but the main structure is the same. 3 name categories, and then in the case of the number 2 category, the non-proprietary, a prefix, an infix, and a suffix. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about that, get into a little bit more detail. So go to the next slide, please, number 4. So here we have some example small molecule stems, and most of these are suffixes, but some are a prefix, such as penicillins, the PEN part, or cephalosporins, CEF. Okay, so let's go to next slide, please. Okay, so here we go. Here now is a comparison, and this should be reassuring. Small molecules and biologics, same kind of style. So you see On our slide, we have some examples of small molecules with a suffix, and we have some examples of biologics with a suffix. So right now, we're treating everything pretty much in the same way. Now we're going to get a little bit more complicated. So please go to the next slide. So we called the previous one, we called those stems. So these are suffixes, so syllables, stems. Now we're going to talk about schemes. Now, in the case of stems, the World Health Organization manages all those, and there's about 300 of them in use today. In schemes, there are about 7 categories of drugs that have scheme requirements. So the scheme is a more complicated name, and there's usually 3 parts. There's a prefix, an infix, and a suffix. And some of these are really complicated. Some of these are not just one word, but they even go to 2 words. And you see on the bottom of the slide, I have 3 examples of gene therapy drugs with a 2-word non-proprietary name. And these are complicated words. I mean, you look at it, you know, exacabagene silolucel. I mean, it's awful complicated and it's intimidating, but you should just sort of what I feel like I understand is you've got the STEM approach and you got the scheme approach. The scheme approach is for more complicated drug names. So that's it. That's the whole deal with drug namings on small molecules and on biologics. Okay, now we're going to go to the next slide, please. And we'll have some examples. Now here is a monoclonal antibody. This is the scheme that is proposed by the World Health Organization. And you see that the infix, which is in the middle of the word, has definitions. So in small molecules, we didn't have this. We had therapeutic categories. But in biologics, we have to define things. So what it does is it makes for more options and tells you more about your drug. So all those categories are listed. For example, if there's a fung in the name, F-U-N-G, it's a fungal source or a fungal protein or something like that. So then, well, go to the next slide, please. So now we see Adelinumab, which is popular drug, Humira, where its name is broken out into 4 different categories. And this was a scheme that was proposed a few years ago. And so the first part is random, the ADA, that was supplied by the drug company. Then the next is the therapeutic target, which is a tumor. And then the next part is, it's a human-based immunoglobulin, that's the U part. And the MAB is a monoclonal antibody. So you see, that's how that name was developed. So there's a definition associated with each component of the name. So you can learn a lot about your drug based on the name. Okay, next slide, please. We're going to have another complication here of naming instituted by FDA. And so what FDA is doing is adding a suffix, another suffix, so it's a different kind of suffix, onto the drug name, and it's 4 random letters attached to the non-proprietary name. So what you see, when the reference product, the first drug that's approved, is in the far left column here, so it's the brand name, then the non-proprietary name. So in the first one, we have filgrastim. And then competitors come out, and there we have Zaxio and Milvestim, and they have a new name, which is filgrastim, with 4 random letters. And so we're going to identify each approved biosimilar by those additional 4 letters. So that gets even more complicated, but it really is pretty straightforward, and it's strictly a US FDA proposal. all the foreign countries don't use the US FDA system there. So that's another definition of the word suffix. Okay, I think we're done with biologics. The last thing I'm going to show you, just reinforcing what Karen described, is the shirt I'm wearing today. You see, has a little thing here. It says D2E7, which is Humira back in the development days. So that was an example of the alternate chemical name for a drug molecule. Okay, Stacey, back to you.
You have both mentioned a variety of terms: chemical name, bioequivalent, STEM, scheme, and reference drug. Why so many terms? And can you give us a couple of examples of how these terms help to more accurately name and classify drugs? Karen, I'm going to throw that one out to you first.
Sure. Well, the one thing I wanted to also share was the fact that with the small molecules, when a drug goes off patent, we have the different names that are available. And I think sometimes it's hard for people to know what to call the product. Do they refer to it by the innovator proprietary name, or do they refer to it by the generic name? And there are excellent resources available to help us with the naming conventions and to understand more about the compounds. So there, for the US, the FDA has a database called the Orange Book for small molecule drugs, and it's free. We have easy access to it. You can see it online easily, and it will reference it will provide the reference listed drug, what we call the RLD, which is normally it's the innovator. And then it would have all of the other generic options that are available as well. And it will also have the therapeutic equivalency ratings for as compared to the reference leader drug. So, that's available as well. And, there's differences in pharmaceutical equivalents, pharmaceutical alternatives, therapeutic equivalents. And, I'll leave it at that for now. I'll let Paul jump in, and then we can talk about how, I don't know if you want to go in some of the history of how some of the names were developed before we went into the stems, but we can do that as well.
Yeah, I think that would be great to just have a little bit of historical knowledge of the process.
Karen, go ahead. You know the most about the history, I think.
Okay. So it's interesting. I haven't practiced pharmacy in a very long time. It's been 20 some years since I've actually put a foot inside of a pharmacy, but it's interesting, when you think about how these names are and you look back at it, prior to the 1960s, generic names were really just a reflection of the chemical compound name. And what they tried to do was shorten the names to make it a little more usable. And a perfect example of this is a compound that I think, or I should say a product that most people know as Tylenol. So Tylenol in the US is known as acetaminophen, and in Europe, it's known as paracetamol. So there are two different generic names that are available globally. But both of those names are just shortened names of the chemical compound name of N-acetyl para-aminophenol. So they just kind of shortened it and made it a little bit easier. But it's interesting, the AMA USP nomenclature committee way back in the day recognized that there were three main difficulties with these chemically derived names. There were so many chemical syllables that it became too complex and unmanageable for individuals to deal with. And then there are common chemically derived syllables that were so overused, the names were starting to become confusing. And then there were also, the chemical names were so complex that they really were not meaningful to physicians. So there was no connection to the name in regards to what that compound does. And that all, causes a lot of confusion. So over time, there was definitely programs and committees that were put in place to help that. But ultimately in the US in the 60s, the US Adopted Name Council was created to help select concise generic names. And the FDA actually joined that effort in 1967. And it's interesting, which I found this kind of amusing when I was doing a little bit of research. The AMA, they actually were concerned about this. They did not want to adopt a position that drugs should be labeled so the patients would even know what they were taking. They thought that the patients should sometimes not be informed as to what was actually in their medication, because they felt that the patient might then try to outguess their doctor and start making decisions on their own. And today it's completely different, because drug information is available everywhere in the US. You can get it anywhere. But it's just interesting. So in the meantime, the United States Adopted Name Council started, and then the World Health Organization, INN, or International Non-Proprietary Naming Program, was started. And that's where now we have simple generic names that are being chosen and used so that it makes a difference, so that healthcare professionals can kind of identify with the compounds, know what it is. And then it also makes it easier from a patient perspective. And then once the products get on the generic market and there's multiple companies making the same thing, it just standardizes it. It makes it less confusing.
Yeah, and I guess that would be especially important when you are producing drugs that are being distributed globally, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And even, from a global perspective, the generic names are typically the same, not always. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of a difference, but the brand names are different. And that can really get confusing. When you're supporting products from a global perspective and you're talking to your offices in, wherever, Israel or Brazil, the names are completely different. And so for me, it's easier at work to actually refer to it by the generic name or refer to it by our internal code names. It causes less confusion, and there's less opportunity for mistakes to occur.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I'm just thinking, even from a consumer standpoint, if I was traveling abroad, it might be easier for me to find, a Tylenol or Advil, let's say, but using the generic name as opposed to a brand name, which is probably completely different, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, 100%.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. So
the WHO standardizes all the names, and then they translate them too. So where you have slight translation differences, but the generic names are pretty much, the same.
Right.
So it really is highly organized. And, going back to what Karen said about the chemical names, some of the other ones are just a nightmare. You had drugs like morphine is named after a Greek god, and is named after another god. And then there's belladonna, which is beautiful lady in Italian. And there's a few other ones. Bacitracin has to do with a patient named Tracy. And
no kidding.
Of the name. So, if you take all the drugs that we have today and had no system, we would have thousands of generic names, and it would be a nightmare to understand them. So we are pretty organized now, even though some of the words are a little intimidating and complicated. It really is quite simple in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely organized. You can tell there's a system that goes into this. Some of those names you were just describing a short time ago, though, feels like, you need to have your PhD just to be able to pronounce some of them. But the organization, the planning that goes into them, and the standardization is certainly very helpful. I want to talk a little bit about another issue, which is look-alike, sound-alike, or LASA drug names. Karen, I'm hoping you can help kick us off with this and provide some examples of drug name problems that result from the look-alike or sound-alike issues.
Sure. So we might want to pull up slide number 5, just so there's a visual if people want to take a look at it. They don't have to. But obviously, the look-alike, sound-alike drugs are a huge potential issue in regards to medication errors. So, so in looking at, doing some research for this, I found one estimate that 1 in every 1,000 medication orders in a hospital and or a pharmacy are typically associated with the healthcare professionals selecting the wrong drug while either it's being prescribed, transcribed, dispensed, or administering the medication.
That's scary.
It is. And I think it's one of the reasons I left the practice of pharmacy. It's just, for me, it wasn't enjoyable, but there's a lot of stress. You have a lot of, you're getting pulled in a lot of different directions. You're answering the phones, you're dealing with patients, and, depending on what the volume of prescriptions you're seeing at your location, whether it be a hospital or a retail pharmacy, it can be stressful, and, we're human and things happen. So
Right.
It's helpful to have a process to help with that and hopefully reduce these errors. But as you were mentioning, one of the key causes of the errors is just drug name similarity.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a visual similarity, a similar lengths of a drug name, the number or groups of similar characters within a name, and the same characters within a name. And on top of that, you can add in equivalent strengths, dosing routes, dosage forms, indications, frequency of use, and product labeling can also be an issue with that, because sometimes the product labeling from a specific company, they all might look the same. They might use the same coloring format. So
Right.
that has started to change over time as well. But the specific, one specific technique that is used to help assist healthcare professionals in dealing with look-alike, sound-alike is a technique called tall man lettering, and that is the example here on the slide. So tall man lettering is actually a term that was coined by ISMP, or the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, and it describes a method for differentiating the unique letters and characters of similar drug names known to have been confused with one another. And it starts with typically a drug name being printed in lowercase letters, and then the tall man or the capital letters are used to highlight the differences between similar drug names so that it helps decrease confusion. So we're accentuating a unique portion of a drug name with uppercase letters. And you can also use other means such as color, bolding, contrasting, anything to draw the attention to those dissimilarities. And that helps the healthcare provider decrease any chance of confusion with another drug that could be, right next to it. And some of the perfect examples, there's quite a few here on the slide, but prednisone versus prednisolone. You have dobutamine versus dopamine, and vinblastine versus vincristine. So these tall man lettering approaches are used, not only just on drug labels, but they're used in computer systems for order entry, on patient medication administration records. You can also find them on prescription labels that actually go to the patient themselves, and on the finished drug product labels that come out of the pharmaceutical companies. Another technique, I should say, that is also used to help minimize medication errors is the use of barcoding now. So being able to scan barcodes kind of also removes that element of human error and confusion, because hopefully the computers are programmed correctly and the barcodes are read correctly. And that just really also helps to decrease any errors.
Yeah, it's a much more automated method, but you definitely could see in the tall man lettering how it draws your eye right to that different piece, right? Even though most of the word might be the same or similar, it draws you right in and helps you differentiate much more quickly. I also know that, well, you were talking about the package similarities, and it might be naming similarities, etc. And I know that confusion or medication errors can also occur from modifiers. And we see that in some big name brands like Tylenol, and then Tylenol PM and so Paul, can you tell us a little bit more about how modifiers can create confusion for some of these drugs?
Sure. So modifiers, first off, defining modifiers. Modifiers are the extra letters or words or syllables that are part of the name. So that this is part of the proprietary name. And the objective is marketing.
Right.
But what you have is drug companies saying, I want to enhance recognition of my product by adding a modifier. So that's the main objective. And FDA has put guidance documents together on how to form a modifier and so forth. So they're really aware that modifiers are a cause of problems. Now, we looked at modifiers in one of the papers that we published a couple of months ago, and there's really 3 categories of modifiers. So, there's just so many possibilities for problems with modifiers.
Yeah,
and
I can see where it's definitely confusing even for healthcare professionals.
Absolutely. They forget to use them, or they don't write them properly, or they omit them, or what they'll say is Depakote, take 1 tablet every 24 hours. But they only said Depakote, which is a 4-hour tablet. So you see the healthcare provider, the pharmacist, or whomever dispenses the drug has got to check back with the doctor and verify if everything is correct. Right. So it's expanding just a little bit further. Karen mentioned the tall man lettering, which is good for written words, but you also have to worry about pronunciation. And of course, got a lot of non-English speaking doctors that pronounce things in their own ways. And then you have pull down menus, and you've got autocorrect functions on computer screens. There was a pretty famous incident a few years ago where the autocorrect caused a name change and it killed somebody. So, there's just a terrible number of errors, all connected with the drug name, and hence the objective: do a better job in industry to try to prevent these problems from happening.
Absolutely, absolutely, so important. What kind of human factors testing is required prior to the market release of products? Are they checking with healthcare professionals and testing these names, with consumers and doctors and pharmacists prior to releasing them? It would be the first part of that question. And then I'm also just curious if they've ever had to make any changes or recalls because the names were just too confusing.
Oh yeah, the most famous of those is Lasix, which is a widely used diuretic.
Right.
And when another drug came out named Losec, L-O-S-E-C. So you can imagine how many problems there were.
Right.
They actually made the Losec company change the name, and it became Prilosec. But I think in Europe, you still have Lasix and Losec on the market. But human factors, a very good question. FDA has a guidance on proprietary names. It's an extensive guidance. It's about 30 plus pages. And there's 2 things that strike me in that guidance. One called simulation studies, and they prescribe what they expect from companies. Now, companies actually hire outside consultants to conduct these studies, but they have a list of different scenarios, and they may have 20 different scenarios that they expect people to show that their drug names are not a problem. And, there may be a total of 70 or 75 people involved in these simulation studies. And so then you have to do multiple trials, and, you're talking about written transcription and spoken transcription and technicians to pharmacists to doctors and so forth. So all these categories of people and categories of scenarios are all combined, and FDA expects to see that when things are filed. So that's where these consultant companies come in. They conduct these studies, and then the companies work with them, of course, and then they propose a name.
Right.
And so that's that. Then there's also a computer program that it's called the, let's see, POCA, POCA. It's the phonetic and orthographic computer analysis of the name. And so FDA runs the name through the program, and the drug companies have access to the program as well. And then a evaluation comes out as being highly similar to other drug names, medium similarity, or low similarity. And if it's a low similarity, then it gets approved. If it's a high similarity, you go back and forth. And sometimes these naming exercises, take a lot of time and delay release and so forth.
Sure.
So those are a couple of the things that are the human factors components of the drug naming exercise.
Thank you for that. It sounds like the computer system is a good tool for checking and rechecking, because it's possible that you're not going to know every single drug name that's on the market, and you might not connect the dots that it's similar to another one. So I'm glad a resource like that exists.
The ISMP, which is the premier organization for mistakes, they have a list of confused drug names, and there are more than 1,000 drugs listed, and these are just US drugs. Now,
right.
ISMP is a worldwide organization, and they have branches in Canada and Europe and so forth. So I don't know what they have, but the US list of confused drug names is overwhelming.
Yeah, that's quite a large number of confused names, and there's a lot of potential risk there in my mind. What about difficulties or errors that happen from appearance of product? And I'm thinking like dosage forms, like capsules or tablets themselves, or even packaging. Karen, you started to mention labels that might look similar, but even some containers can look almost identical, especially when you're selling in a generic form.
Yeah, and as a pharmacist, you'll always get questions, because once the product goes off patent and becomes available generically, there's no requirements for the generic companies to match the physical appearance of the product, of the proprietary product. And obviously the proprietary company would rather you not do that to begin with. So they want that brand recognition. They want you to purchase their product. And the patients will notice it. You will get phone calls, hey, I got my prescription refilled, and now it's a white tablet. Before it was blue. What happened? You gave the wrong drug. So they automatically will question that, which is good. You want them to be aware of what they should be taking. But, sizes of bottles and appearance and, just like you were saying before, the labeling appearances, all of that can just really cause confusion. So it really is helpful to take time to really understand what the patient is getting. I was laughing because we were talking about the modifiers, and it made me think back this is probably 20 years back when we were allowed to hand out tchotchkes and magnets and all that fun stuff. I remember a magnet that I had, and I used to laugh at it. Lord knows what happened to it, but it was for a laxative product. And it said, take 2 in the AM for a BM in the PM. And I'm thinking, how confusing would that be now? I mean, that would probably never even get out the front door, because people are like, am I taking it in the morning? Am I taking it at night? What's happening when? It's just those kind of marketing tools are confusing. Right. And we just have to be careful as an industry what we're doing.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I notice even when I go to get an, over-the-counter pain reliever, let's just say, you notice that the generic bottles are using the same color as the proprietary product that they are meant to, be interchangeable with, I guess. And that is a marketing ploy, right? They're trying to get you to say, hey, this is just like Tylenol, or this is just like Advil or Aleve or whatever it is. But I think that can be confusing. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I am not a pharmacist, but from my understanding, drugs that are in a generic form have to have the same active ingredients as the proprietary drug, but that they don't necessarily have to have the same inactive ingredients. So you could have slightly different compositions. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, and when I was mentioning the Orange Book before, the Orange Book has a really good glossary associated with it. So there's products that are called pharmaceutical equivalents, which are identical from a dosage form perspective and route of administration and identical amounts of active ingredient. And then there are also pharmaceutical alternatives, which contain the same therapeutic moiety, but might be a little bit different in amount or the dosage form, or a different salt or ester when it comes to the active ingredient. So that can be a little bit different. And then there are also products that are considered to be therapeutic equivalents. And so they can be different, but be used for the same therapeutic indication. So there's different categories depending on where you lie in the Orange Book. You can look at that, and it all goes back to the comparison of that reference listed drug or the lead drug that is from the innovator.
Yeah,
So,
I would think that's super important, especially if you have sensitivities or allergies or things like that to certain ingredients, right? The pharmacist or the doctor needs to know which alternatives are going to be suitable for you.
right, and there's one thing I'll mention too is kind of interesting when it comes to products that are over the counter. Patients have a choice.
Right.
They're going to take a look at that label and say, oh, I see lactose is in as an inactive ingredient. I have a lactose intolerance. So in their mind, they immediately cannot take that.
Right.
But if you're in ICU and you're, dealing with a life-threatening illness and they say, hey, look, you need to take this product, you're not going to question it, whether it has lactose in it or not. You'll deal with the lactose intolerance. So it's just a lot of that, all that information becomes a lot more critical to patients when it's available to them from an OTC perspective.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
No, let me contribute a little bit on this. Can you go back to the slides? I think it's slide number 11. And it talks about how we approve a generic drug.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking now about a small molecule drug. So let's say the innovator, like Valium, and then the competitor, the generic product, diazepam. So what happens is the chemicals are identical. It's got to be identical chemical, but the other ingredients don't have to be identical. So these are inactives. So, other than allergy, there really isn't too much issue with those. And so what you do is you have two groups of patients, and group A gets Valium, group B gets diazepam, and then they get blood samples drawn. And so you see on this graph, we're taking blood samples every couple of hours for about 24 hours or longer. And then you statistically and then you flip-flop them. So then the group A now will get diazepam, and group B will get Valium. And we'll combine all that data. And now you do a statistical comparison, and FDA has guidelines for what sort of testing you need to do and calculations and so forth. And so that's the measure of bioequivalence. And we call these bioequivalent formulations, and the pharmacist or the drug companies can interchange them. Like one time, as Karen explained, you get product A one time, and then the next time you get from a different company, but it's bioequivalent. So you shouldn't have any worry about equivalent performance. So that's the meaning of the word bioequivalent.
Yeah, and I think that's a great graphic there, because it shows that they really are not only the same ingredients, but they're reacting pretty much the same when they're taken.
If you look on this slide number 12 or 13, I forget which one it is, it shows that there's a side chain difference And so a very small difference in biologics. That's why in biologics, we don't do the same kind of testing. What we do is a clinical testing. So it says this drug, so let's call the reference product. Remember Karen mentioned reference product, that's the innovator product, is slightly different at a molecular level to the biosimilar. So we're not doing the same kind of testing. We're just doing clinical testing. But that's why FDA adds that extra little 4-letter suffix onto the biosimilar product. So they'll be able to track if a patient gets the reference product and then they get the biosimilar product. We have to inform the doctor, inform the patient. State laws are different in every state, but there's a lot of communication. So that, and the whole point of it is FDA says they want pharmacovigilance, meaning we track the performance of the patient.
Right.
These things are not interchangeable. You know, generics, small molecules, interchangeable. In biologics, there are no interchangeable drugs. There's a FDA guidance that explains what a company has to do, but it's much more involved, much more complicated. So
yeah,
that's where terms like so you know, in each regulatory guidance, there's a big statement that says a biosimilar is not a generic. And of course, common language, we say, oh yeah, biosimilars, yeah, those are generics. But they're not, because they're tested differently, they're different chemicals, and their administration to the patient is different. So biosimilars are not generics.
So there's so much that we have to take into consideration. And I mean, obviously you can see where there's so much room for error, but the guidances and all of these tactics and techniques that you've mentioned are really all in an effort to help with patient safety and help doctors and other health practitioners make the right choice from the beginning, because it can be confusing. So I appreciate all that you shared. And of course, we will share with our listeners links to ISMPE and the Orange Book and all of the other regulatory guidance for drug naming and medication error so that they can review for themselves, because there is a lot there. You know, it definitely will take you some time to sort through it all. But as we get ready to wrap up the episode, Karen, I just want to come back to you and see if you have any last thoughts or comments for the industry and for our listeners.
The only other thing I'll add, which I just think it's another really good resource if folks are interested in looking into it, is the USP Dictionary of United US Adopted Names. And that also will have the it'll have the generic name, it'll have the international non-proprietary names listed. And it's just I've always found it to be a very helpful resource for me. So if anybody's interested in looking into that, their companies probably have access to it, but it's the USP Dictionary.
Excellent. Paul, any last thoughts or comments for our listeners?
Just that industry really has to do a good job in designing their names, and they got to think the written word, the spoken word, and the electronic word, and you know, work on the names, work on the strengths, work on how the dosages are expressed, work on the appearance of the tablets or the capsules, work on the appearance of the labels. Okay, and if they do a good job at this, it's in their interest, because they'll get faster approvals, they'll get no bad publicity from drug errors, and then, you know, finally they won't have to do changes like I mentioned, the LASIX and the LOSIC. There's about a dozen changes every year that FDA goes to a company and say, we have too many mistakes, you got to change your name. And that's a nightmare, because of what you have to do, changing labels, changing promotional literature, changing the insert, going back to the FDA with a new name.
Yeah.
So it's in the industry's interest to do a good job.
For sure. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you both for sharing all of that information. I learned so much, and there is quite a bit there. So I encourage our listeners to go ahead and go to our show notes download the PowerPoint presentation so you can see the slides that accompany some of this conversation, as well as the resources that we will include, links to the regulatory information, et cetera. But thank you, Karen and Paul, for being with us today and really giving us a great lesson in medication naming errors. It's been great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also like to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and most importantly, a big thank you to you, our valued listeners. I'm grateful for your time each week and for your help in sharing this podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and be sure to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick note or leave an online review. We'd love to share your feedback with our networks. For show notes and additional podcast information, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another engaging discussion. Until then, make it a great week.